fact, when I read Newman made a statement that shocked me. In spite of the fact that I had grown pretty friendly to Catholicism in the form of Chesterton, at least patient to listen to it, Newman said something that shocked me. He said that for the historian, history says many things, it's got many ambiguities, but the one thing you can definitely be certain when you look at the records of the past, and that is that the Christianity of history is not Protestantism. And I was shocked, deeply shocked by that statement. I said, can it really be as clear as that? Would we have all of these people thinking all these different ways if it were as simple as that? And so that drove me to try to find some of the writings of these church fathers myself. I didn't buy any. I'm not an educated man, really. I don't know any Greek and didn't finish college. But so I was a little worried that I wouldn't be able to figure out what all this was about. But I went to a Christian bookshop, a Protestant Christian bookshop, and found in the back, squirreled away on a back shelf, a set of hardback books called the Ante-Nicene Fathers. There were 10 volumes. And Ante-Nicene means the period prior to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
It doesn't mean those guys, they were against Nicaea.
No, ante in the sense of before, exactly. There were some Ante-Nicene writers, but in that sense, but not these men. So I was astounded. I picked up the first volume, and it didn't have a word in it written later than 200 AD. And I had never imagined that there was anything that survived from that period. We had always been told that the early church was this nebulous golden age, and the idea that there were actually records from the early church, and not just some records, but hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation, was a revelation to me. And so as I opened up these books, it was like dropping down the rabbit hole into Wonderland. And I was astonished by this and began to dig very deeply into the writings of the early church fathers. And for practically a year, I didn't read anything except the apostolic fathers, the ones that either knew or were personally discipled by the apostles, the very first church fathers, or the Bible. Those were the only things I read for almost a whole year.
Pause for a second.
Yeah, sure.
There's a statement that Paul makes to Timothy in his second letter, in which he's encouraging this young bishop and how he's to catechize and to train. He makes a statement in 2 Timothy 2:2. He says, "What you have heard from me before many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also."
Right.
So you have Paul, well actually you have Jesus to Paul, to Timothy, to those other witnesses who will choose other men who can teach others.
A chain of custody,
you have these
you might
chains.
even say.
And the authors that you're talking about are in that very chain that he's talking about.
Exactly.
Not an extension of it.
Right.
But within that group of friends.
Every student of the New Testament knows that Peter was the bishop of the church at Antioch, the first place where we were called Christians. Yeah. One of his successors, personally converted by him, according to the records we have, was Clement of Rome. And Clement of Rome is one of the fathers that and mentioned by name in the Bible. He's one of the fathers whose writings we possess today. So as I dug into these writings, the next shocking paradigm shift was on just about every page I started finding unmistakably Catholic things.
For example?
Well, in Clement you find very clearly the idea of apostolic succession. In Ignatius, who was another disciple of Peter's, you find him use the actual term, the Catholic Church. You find him very clearly teaching the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. This was not a symbolic, you find him teaching baptismal regeneration, something that, the idea that grace is actually imparted in baptism and our sins are actually washed away. You find this idea in all of the church fathers and nothing contrary to it.
And you don't find faith alone.
Right. You find grace alone, but not faith alone.
Right.
And on every page, I can only ask my skeptical audience tonight to go and examine the records themselves. Because if you do, you'll have the same experience I did, and that is that you'll find all sorts of things that simply aren't supposed to be there. These ideas were not supposed to exist until the Dark Ages. And yet here they were. There was veneration in 159, or is it somewhere in there, 155, 56, with the martyrdom of Polycarp. You find that Polycarp's bones, after he was martyred, were taken off and put in a church where they could be used every year in an anniversary celebration of his martyrdom. You find relics, and this is in the 2nd century A.D. by a man who was personally discipled by John the Beloved.
That's what I would tell the audience. I know I've told the audience this before, that when I received a copy of your book, and I knew you before you wrote the book, but did I know you were writing it? I don't know if I did.
I may have mentioned it.
You may have kept it under wraps, but
I didn't know.
When I read the book, I thought, finally, there's a book that I can recommend to introduce people to these early fathers, because sadly the collections that you normally find of these early fathers often are non-Catholic collections, so what you have is explanatory material beforehand, kind of giving a revisionist background to explain what they're going to say.
It's pretty shocking even in that form.
Yeah,
even some of the books I read were from a Protestant publisher.
Although when I was in seminary, my reading, I read one section by Justin Martyr in which, and he's from the middle of the 2nd century, right? And he gives us his explanation of what the early worship service was like.
Right.
But the part that I received did not have the part about the Eucharist.
Right. Many times, I don't want to give the impression that Protestants don't know the Church Fathers exist. These aren't some sort of lost books of the Bible that are dubious and come from some strange source. Protestants know these books exist. They admit that they're historical records of that period. And, all the material I'm talking about is there for everyone to see. There's no question. And we'll talk in a minute about how and for a while, and many Protestant readers and commentators get around some of these things. But to me, I read it. Sometimes they'll say, well, you're taking those things out of context. I encourage everyone to read the context, to read the books from beginning to end. Nothing could be better for the unity of the church than for as many people as possible to read these books in context, all of them, all the way through.
And that's why I thank you for this book. I mean, this isn't an infomercial for this book, but I'm unhesitant to say this, though, because this is a great place to start with early fathers, because you pick out 4 the earliest, you trace their relationships of their own conversions back to the apostles, but you also give the context in a very readable story.
Yeah, I once again have to emphasize that I'm no historian or Greek scholar or any of these things.
Say that to me. You did an excellent job.
I say that as a foot in the door for people.
Yeah.
Sometimes this material can seem very formidable to people.
Right.
They think, I could never possibly understand that. It's not difficult.
Oh, this is, very
I wrote this book so that so much of it was buried in very old translations. So much of it was hidden away in formidable-looking books that would scare most people away. The reason I wrote this story was I don't have any qualifications as a scholar, but I do have a certain knack for storytelling. And I thought that if I wrote this up in a little bit more of an approachable style, that I could make some of this material accessible to ordinary people like myself.
Well, you did a fine job, right?
Thank you so much.
We're going to take a